The cabinet, the prime.
They're not indifferent. They're indifferent to non-citizens who hate them, who want to destroy them, right? They are passionate for Jewish Israelis and the best interests and survival of the Jewish state, and with creating an environment for the Jewish state that is most optimal for its thriving. So when you hear that someone's a hater, right, the flip side of that is that they love some things and some people, right? So all these parts of the country, such as like Dallas in the 1960s, supposedly so filled with hate, well, that was just the flip side of the love of parts of Dallas for traditional American identity. So anti-Semites are people who love their non-Jewish people whose best interest they see as threatened by Jewish people. And those with anti-Islamic prejudice, right? It's not some irrational, idiocy that has overcome them. Instead, they see Islam as threatening the best interests, the survival, and the thriving of their particular people.
Prime Minister, he says, they signal to the Shin Bet that if a Jew is killed, that's terrible. If an Arab is killed, that's not good, but it's not the end of the world. Ayalon's assessment was echoed by many other officials we interviewed.
Yeah, most people tend to care about their in-group more than they care about the enemy. The neologist says, religion is why Palestinians refuse to recognize a Jewish right to a sovereign homeland in the Levant. Well, you live in an abstract world. So for you, words and religious teachings and religious text and philosophical doctrines and theological principles are what cause people to operate. The average Palestinian has an IQ of about 82. Right? The average Palestinian cannot even develop a theology or a coherent ideology. Right? They're simply not cognitively capable of that. Most Americans don't have a coherent political philosophy. Very few people have a coherent political philosophy or set of coherent religious beliefs. And yet you believe, even though it doesn't exist anywhere in the world where most citizens or most members of a particular people have a coherent religious outlook, but you believe that the Palestinians somehow are the one exception to how the world works.
Mark Schwartz, a retired American three-star general, was the top military official working at the United States Embassy in Jerusalem from 2019 to 2021, overseeing international support efforts for the partnership between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. There's no accountability. He says now of the long history of settler crimes and heavy-handed Israeli operations in the West Bank.
Yeah, there is accountability, but the accountability is not what he wishes, right? It's simply a different type of accountability. The accountability is, are you acting in the best interest of your people? Right? Jewish Israelis are not terribly opposed to the actions of these extremist Jewish settlers. They don't see these settlers as the enemy. They see the Palestinians as the enemy.
These things eat away at trust and ultimately the stability and security of Israel and the Palestinian territories.
So a lack of enforcement of the law, lack of devotion to abstract principles eats away at trust. You know what? It eats away at trust even more when people don't act in alignment with the best interests of the people they love the most, right? When people act against the best interests of their people, when people do not put a top priority on their own people's survival and thriving, that eats away at trust. Diversity eats away at trust, right? Israelis have less trust for each other because of the presence of millions of Palestinians in their midst who hate them, want them dead, right? How trusting would you be walking down the street if you realized that your neighborhood was filled with people who want you dead, who want your state dead?
It's undeniable. How did a young nation turn so quickly on its own democratic ideals?
Absolutely absurd. Israel was founded by ethnic cleansing, right? You wouldn't have a modern Jewish state of Israel if they didn't do as much ethnic cleansing as they did back in the 1948 War of Independence. And the reason Israel didn't cleanse completely all the Palestinians in their midst is because of international pressure. If Israel could have possibly done it, it would have driven out effectively all the Palestinians in their midst. And the presence of Palestinians of 2, 3, 5, 7 million Palestinians in their midst, depending on how you define the state of Israel, whether it's Greater Israel or the legal limits of the state of Israel, right? How exactly is Israel stronger for the presence of millions of people who hate it and want it dead and destroyed? Right? How does that increase trust?
and at what price? Any meaningful answer to these questions has to take into account how a half-century of lawless behavior that went largely unpunished propelled a radical form of ultranationalism to the center of Israeli politics.
A radical form of ultranationalism. So putting the top priority on your people's survival and your people's thriving, right, from a liberal perspective, that's radical ultranationalism. To me, it has a substantial commonsensical component. Now, you can make arguments that the behavior of these extremist West Bank Jewish settlers and the heinous things that they're doing against Palestinians is not in Israel's best interest. But you don't hear that argument. All you're hearing so far in this New York Times Sunday Magazine piece is how these settlers are violating abstract principles of law and of philosophy and of fair dealing, right? I'm sure you can make a substantial case for why this settler behavior is pragmatically against Israel's best interests. But you don't see people making that case very much. Instead, they'd much rather preoccupy themselves with violations of abstract principles and laws, as though laws are objective and don't require human beings who operate in a subjective and flawed fashion to carry them out and enforce them.
This is the history that is told here in 3 parts. In part 1, we describe the origins of a religious movement that established Jewish settlements in the newly won territories.
You don't need a religion to look out for your group's best interests. Now, it's often much more socially acceptable to use religious language and a religious guise to act in a certain way, right? You'll get less pushback identifying in a religious fashion as opposed to a racial fashion, all right? You'll get to have more social status and prestige if you cloak your behavior and your priorities in religious language rather than in racial language. But the language that people use is not necessarily what's really driving them, right? There are 2 reasons for why people do things. One is the stated reason, the other is the true reason. So to think that people mean what they say is silly, it's absurd, it's naive. The neologist says in the chat, Netanyahu government, IDF and Mossad knew that Hamas planned to attack Israel on the 7th. The IDF laid back for 7 hours to allow their people whom they love so much to be slaughtered for political reasons. I don't believe that. So you would prefer a conspiratorial perspective on why Israel was so incompetent on the 7th of October. I don't go for far-fetched conspiracy theories when simple incompetence seems to account for what happened on October 7th. Right? There's nothing inherent in being Jewish that makes you competent 100% of the time. Right? In some situations, some Jews are highly competent. In other situations, other Jews are highly incompetent. The IDF and the Shin Bet and the Israeli political system was highly incompetent on October 7th. But a lot of people I know can't handle that truth, so they've got to come up with these far-fetched conspiracy theories that the IDF just deliberately allowed this attack to go on for political reasons. Now, Israel would likely enjoy a bigger conflagration because then they'd have more and more excuse for just pushing the Palestinians out.